show me around your record collection.
All right, so where to start? Maybe at the A's.
In case you didn't know, I'm speaking to Mark Stryker, who is an eminent jazz historian and writer who is deeply tied to the city that we're currently in, which is Detroit.
Jazz records start over here, LPs start here, and they go down here, all of this, and then around the corner there's actually more jazz records, and then the classical records start, and they go like this, and over there, and then down here, lower, all these box sets, that's all opera. I'm a huge opera person. And so...
How many units total do we have here?
Well, that's a good question. The last time I did a reasonable count, I was around 6,000. In 1998, Elliott Carter turned 80.
Okay.
And who knew that he was going to have 20 more years, more than 20 more years of being productive as a composer. And so, I was working for the Detroit Free Press at the time, covering classical music and jazz, and working as a reporter and as a critic. And really classical music, that was like the main part of my music writing at the Free Press. So Elliott Carter was turning 80, and I thought, well, let's do a story about Elliott Carter. And so I went out to Connecticut to his, he had a summer place basically in Connecticut.
Cool.
Not too far from where Charles Ives lived.
Cool.
And I spent better part of a day with Carter. I had lunch out there, his wife made lunch, and we sat outside, and he was 80, and he told me he had just started to reread all of Montaigne in French. And
wow.
And we had a great conversation. I mean, he said he remembered. He said that Duke Ellington came to hear the premiere of his first symphony. At one point, they had a conversation, and Ellington said, "I think what you're doing with jazz is interesting." He heard Charlie Parker and the gang on 52nd Street in New York.
Wow.
I
did not know that.
You'd be talking to him, and you'd be thinking, he sounds so alive and fresh and contemporary. And then he would say something like, well, I met Charles Ives in a speakeasy in the 20s. And you go, oh, holy shit. It was really, it was interesting. And I had an interesting connection with him too, which is that, when I was at the University of Illinois, I played in the jazz band that was directed by John Garvey, who was a legend. And John had been grown up as a classical viola player. And when he came to the University of Illinois in the 50s, John was a member of the Walden String Quartet. The Walden String Quartet was more or less a contemporary music quartet that was in residence at the University of Illinois. Elliott Carter, when he wrote his first quartet, sent the score out to like dozens of quartets, and the only one that wrote back and said, we will play this, was the Walden String Quartet.
Was it his first string quartet?
Yeah.
So they made a good choice because it went on to win the Pulitzer Prize.
Did the first or the second one?
Maybe it's the second.
The second won the Pulitzer.
Okay.
But the first was a landmark quartet, and a really important piece in Carter's formalizing his ideas of metric modulation, and evolving time signatures and rhythmic ideas.
Right.
Anyway, Elliott had very warm memories of John and the Walden Quartet for taking a chance on him in 1950, and they recorded that piece for Columbia Masterworks, and I'm not going to get up and go over and get it, but right over there, it's in the stack of classical records, filed under C from Elliott Carter.
Okay, so John Garvey, of course, is a legend at the U of I. Just to clarify for the audience, we both attended the University of Illinois. What years were you? You were there in...
I graduated in 1985, so I was there from 85, and then I stayed in Champaign until 87.
Right.
But I was actually in school 81 to 85.
One thing that struck me while reading your book, Jazz from Detroit, is that I wish every city had a historian and a great writer who cared enough to make a similar tract about that location, because Champaign-Urbana would be a fascinating book. In fact, you know what? I'm hereby requesting that you tackle that next. I'm reminded of this David Foster Wallace article that he wrote about the schools along I-80. And he sort of credited the attitude of a lot of those universities along I-80 where there were, physicists and poets and all people from all different backgrounds operating at an extremely high level with funding, with no distraction, with space and, labs and equipment and things like that. So he tells stories about, for fun, him and his friends would do experiments on the corn, in the science lab, because one of his friends' dads was a physicist or whatever. And even when I was in school there, I was there from 2007 to 2011, there was still like this beautiful aura of freedom and exploration and cross-germination of different disciplines. And
one of the things is that there was no people there were not in silos, and particularly as a jazz musician, when I was in school, there was no jazz degree program. There was no jazz department.
Right.
There were a few jazz courses.
Right.
There were a number of jazz bands. John led the top band.
Joe Farrell went to the U of I, and I remember hearing a story that he was practicing jazz in the practice rooms, and he got kicked out. He was a flute major. And he got kicked out of the practice rooms because he was utilizing space that could have been used by another student.
Well, John started the jazz band in 58 or 59, and it was not it really wasn't sanctioned by the music school. And for years and years, I mean, through the 1960s into the 70s, John, that band was one of the best big bands in the country. One of the certainly the most distinctive college band. And one of the reasons was that, half the guys weren't in school. They were just like in town. I mean, people would come, and Ron Dewar, the great saxophone player that mentored many people and influenced generations of people, and had a big impact on Jim McNeely and others, and John Burr and other people that were part of the scene in the early 70s. I mean, I think Ron came in the early 60s, played in the band for like 20 years. And there were certain points where seriously, like half the band was not in school anymore. And you have the same group of guys playing year after year after year, you can begin to really develop an ensemble.
So U of I, let's commission this book. Let's get the funding together, because I'm serious, actually.
I've been buying records since I was 11, 12 years old, and then most of us get into the business of writing about music. At least if you're my age, we all got into music writing so we could get free records.
Well, so anyways, while we're talking about education, let's fast forward to what brought you to Detroit and how you got into criticism and writing.
My father really encouraged me to get a liberal arts degree. If you want to do music, that's fine, but he really believed in the liberal arts training and something to fall back on. And I was a good student, and so that made sense to me. And so I majored in history at the University of Illinois, but I was really a part of the jazz scene.
Sure, yeah.
And after I graduated, worked in the radio station, worked at the classical record store, worked in the bookstore, and began to do a little bit of freelance writing. Got some encouragement from some folks. I had always thought about journalism. Reading and writing was the thing I'd always been good at, and at a certain point realized that as much as I love music, I wasn't in love with the saxophone. And I realized that I had to play for every gig I could play that I really wanted to be at and play, I'd have to do 10 that I didn't. And I was an okay saxophone player, but I wasn't great. And I wanted to do something where I thought I could be great. And journalism always stuck with me. And so I went back to graduate school in journalism at Indiana University back home in Bloomington. And that started me on a career path that took me first to South Bend, Indiana, as an arts reporter, and then to the Dayton Daily News in Dayton, Ohio. And then finally in 1995, I came up here as an arts reporter and a critic covering classical music. When I got here, jazz was not officially part of my job. I made it part of the job. And made it a priority. So I wrote about jazz as much as I could, but the real job here was as a classical music critic and a broader arts reporter covering issues, trends, controversies, whatever they may be. And at a certain point along the way at the Free Press, I picked up visual arts and began covering visual arts too, as a reporter and as a critic. So, so I wore multiple hats, and it meant that when the Detroit Symphony went on strike in 2010 and 11, that was my story. When the city of Detroit fell into bankruptcy, and there was the possibility that because the art at the Detroit Institute of Arts was owned by the city, that art might be sold to cover municipal debt, and that became a huge international story. I was part of the bankruptcy team that covered that. So at the same time I'm covering these, major news stories, cultural news stories, I'm also working as a critic. I'm at the Detroit Symphony every week reviewing concerts. I'm writing profiles of contemporary composers ranging from John Adams to Elliott Carter. And I'm writing about jazz where I can, trying to focus on the Detroit jazz heritage, obviously, and it was out of those experiences, writing about people like Tommy Flanagan and Barry Harris and Joe Henderson, and getting a chance to interview them and spend time with them, and began putting the pieces together mentally for the book Jazz from Detroit. I mean, people often. I came here in 1995. I left the Free Press in 2016. My book was published in 2019. The idea about writing the book came, in the early 2000s when I began sort of thinking about, well, there could be something here. Right. But then when people asked me, how long did it take you to write the book? At the time the book was published, I was 56. I said, well, I'm 56 years old. I mean, it literally, what you do is the sum total of all of your experiences. Right. And the book is the sum total of everything that I've done.
I really want to know what you think, defines the sound of Detroit jazz specifically.
Well, on a basic level, there's this really profound balance of head, intellect, and heart, soul that you hear in Detroit players, and a reverence for tradition. If you can't swing and play the blues in Detroit, you get run over. And yet, having said that, Detroiters are open to all kinds of styles, and are. They are individualists. They're part of this tradition, but part of the tradition in Detroit is that you don't just copy the masters of the past, but you put your own personality, you define it. defined your own place in this continuum. So all of the Detroit players, when you think about Elvin and Paul Chambers and Donald Byrd and Curtis Fuller and Charles McPherson and Joe Henderson and Jerry Allen and Bob Hurst and Regina Carter, all of them embody some of these qualities. Now you go a deeper level, and I think that there's a real respect for craft. Detroit players play their instruments well. They're all well trained. We don't have a lot of like super eccentrics as you might find in other places.
Right.
Our guys and women, come at the instruments in a fairly traditional way. Many of them were trained in the Detroit public schools. They were trained in Western classical music. They all have a technique.
They all have great composition skills and arranging skills.
Right, they know theory, and so you hear that in the way they approach the instruments on a basic level. You also hear that in this kind of musical intelligence in the way people phrase, kind of melodic ideas. You think about somebody like a Barry Harris.
I was just thinking of mine for me too.
Or Joe Henderson or Thad Jones. There's a really deep understanding of melody and harmony and sort of the science of music without squelching the blues, the swing, and the individuality. But and I think a lot of this goes back to. I think you can trace a lot of this back to the great training that people got in the public schools that instilled these sort of fundamental values of just music making. That plus. The influence of Barry Harris as the great mentor here in the 1950s, who taught everybody, and really built into did a lot here, but built into the culture a culture of mentorship within the Detroit jazz tradition, which it continues to this very day.
In reading your book, I was blown away to find the proportion of musicians who came through Cass Technical High School. And then in doing some research about Cass, I was really surprised to see how many modern musicians keep coming. I don't know if it still exists now, but great rappers like Big Sean came out of Cass Tech. Jack White, who we were talking about earlier, the owner of Third Man Records and an incredible musician himself, came out of Cass Tech. And then, so I would love to hear you talk about the education system, but also informal education in the form of especially the great mentors, Marcus Belgrave and Barry Harris.
One of the major keys to Detroit's jazz legacy is this idea of education, and the Detroit public schools had a reputation from early in the 20th century as being a leader in providing high-quality music education in the public schools. And the Detroit schools were integrated by law since the early part of the 20th century. And even though that there were housing discrimination and other things that were sort of pushing people apart, because the schools were integrated, it meant that black kids got the same opportunities as white kids at places like Cass Tech. And Cass Tech was what we would think of today as kind of a magnet school. And if you went to Cass Tech, you can major in music, you can major in art, you can major in engineering, all of these different disciplines. And the music training at Cass Tech was on an extraordinarily high level. It was like college level music training. And so kids spent half their day in music classes, half in academic, half in music classes. And you study, if you played a wind instrument, you had to study piano. If you played a string instrument, you also had to learn how to play a wind instrument. That's why Ron Carter played cello and then bass in the orchestra at Cass Tech, but then also played alto clarinet in the top concert band.
Wow.
You studied harmony, music history, blah, blah. Gerald Wilson told me, who was at Cass in the 1930s, I learned everything I needed to know at Cass Tech.
Wow.
So Cass, which produced Paul Chambers and Julius Watkins and Ron Carter and Roland Hanna and Alice McLeod, Alice Coltrane, Hugh Lawson, Billy Mitchell, Donald Byrd, all these folks, came through Cass in the 1950s. And then the school, remained influential. Jerry Allen went to Cass. Ralph Armstrong, great bass player, went to Cass. Regina Carter came out of Cass. It's a really great legacy, an extraordinary legacy. It wasn't just Cass that was great. Miller High School, which produced Frank Rosolino, Kenny Burrell, and Yusef Lateef and Milt Jackson, all went to Miller High School. All the high schools had orchestras. They all had great bands. At Northwestern High School, Roy Brooks, Charles McPherson, Lonnie Hillier, and James Jamerson.
Wow.
All had a little band that played for school dances and stuff.
And James Jamerson would go on to record so much legendary music at Motown. Yeah.
On the one hand, you had this great public school music education. And I tell people all the time, if you invest in public school music education, you can change the world. And we know that because that's what we did in Detroit.
I never got to see Hank Jones, but I've read in interviews with him, a reverence for the masters to the point of self-deprecation. Like, I'm only trying to play, but I'm not, I'm barely scratching the surface of what Byrd and Monk did,
I think fundamentally there's a reverence for the art for music, and that a recognition that on some level we're all students. You never stop being a student. Barry took piano lessons into his 80s.
Right, yeah.
Right? Classical piano lessons into his 80s. He embodies that idea of being the perpetual student. What can I do today? What can I learn today that I didn't know yesterday? And I think that there's a reverence for how great Byrd and Dizzy and Bud Powell and Duke Ellington and Louis and all those people were. But I think beyond that, it's really a reverence for music, and that we're all of us in some way are servants of this greater thing.
Right.
This sort of Platonic ideal of what music and jazz music is about, and that. If you start thinking like that, then, you become smaller in the place of all of that rather than larger. And, and you do that without, the humility. It's interesting. It's not a thing of like, well, I'm not worthy. Because to stand up and play like Thad Jones, or to play like Joe Henderson, or to play like Kenny Garrett, or James Carter, or Gerald Cleaver, I mean, you have to be, to play that way, or Kareem Riggins, you have to have a real strong sense of self.
One thing I learned in your book that I did not know before was that Joe Henderson's brother was a saxophone player who was part of an important band here in Detroit.
The Contemporary Jazz Quintet was a band that was co-founded by Ken Cox, great pianist and composer, and Charles Moore, great composer and trumpet player. They formed the band around 1968, and Leon Henderson, Joe's younger brother, and Ron Brooks, a bass player, and Danny Spencer, hell of a drummer, was the group. They were, in the late 60s, early 70s, they were the most important modern post-bop band in Detroit. And they had a brief moment of fame, jazz fame, in that they recorded 2 records for Blue Note. One of which, introducing Kenny Cox and the Contemporary Jazz Quintet, was just reissued on the Blue Note Classic series.
Right, yeah, I listened to it last night, and it's great. It's really good.
Yeah, the compositions are it's loose. It's really Miles, Nefertiti, The Sorcerer, Miles in the Sky. Those records were the foundation of the band's aesthetic. You take that band, you can go backwards to the 50s tradition in Detroit. You can take the band and go forward up until the present day in Detroit. So I think of it as a
fulcrum almost.
Yeah, and it's they did make these records for Blue Note, so there is a reputation for them, but also they epitomize these players that decided to make their living and lives here in Detroit rather than go to one coast or the other.
I love this section of the book too where you talked about, because there's so many people like that all around the country, people who just chose a life that was maybe more comfortable and stable in the sense that they could afford to live at a much lower cost and could do more what they wanted to do, but people might not know about them.
The thing is that, first of all, when you move to a place like Detroit, you quickly realize that for every guy that left and got famous, another person stayed behind who played almost as well, sometimes just as well.
Right.
But maybe they didn't have a personality cut out for New York, or maybe they didn't have, they weren't band leaders, or they
no
were just
desire to do it.
They were great like jam session players, but they weren't composers, and or maybe they had personal problems, or maybe they had young families and they just for whatever reason, and so they're the musicians like that in every major city, and they lead incredibly rich, productive, influential lives in a community. There are all kinds of ways to make a living and a life in music. And by the way, making a living from music and making a life in music, those are different things, right? In Detroit, one of the things that I so love about this place is that the jazz community here, community, that's a sacred word in Detroit. It means something here. And so we have produced this incredible litany of musicians from here that went on to change the course of jazz history, right? That's part of the theme of the book, is that you can't tell the history of jazz in America without also telling the history of jazz from Detroit. But while the diaspora is out there changing the world, the community here in Detroit is changing the city, is enriching the lives of the cultural life of this city, and that goes on. And the Detroit jazz tradition there's at least 2 sort of wings to that. One is the wing, those players that, as I said, the diaspora that go out and the Hank Thad and Elvin Jones and Joe Henderson and Ron Carter and Paul Chambers, Jerry Allen. These are people that change the sounds of their instrument, the way people approach their instruments, right? In jazz. Ron Carter helps create the language of the Miles Davis Quintet. The jazz of the 60s, that doesn't exist without Ron Carter as part of the mix. So that's a huge part of our legacy in here. But the other part of that legacy is like what's happening in Detroit itself, the musicians that live here, the music that they make, the culture that they create that has this, symbiotic relationship with the guys and women that went out and changed the world. One doesn't exist without the other.
Right.
And what most people think of when they think of the Detroit jazz tradition are these famous players that moved away. What I think of is that plus this.
Right.
I've been looking for an original copy of Sonny Rollins' The Night at the Village Vanguard, which is my all-time favorite record. And I've been looking for an original for many years at a price I could afford. And finally, my guys down at People's Records in Detroit called me one day a couple years ago and said, hey, a copy came in.
Oh, cool.
And it...
featuring Detroit's own Elvin Jones.
Elvin Jones on drums. There we go. It's as good as it gets. State of the art. 1957. Everything that happens on that record, you could play the same set at the Vanguard and today, and everybody's mouths would drop.
Absolutely true. Yeah. Wow. So special.
Parts of it are very good. Plus, some of it's very good, but the whatever surface noise, it's really not that troublesome. And it's got all the earmarks of a West 63rd Street Blue Note. It's the deep groove, the Plastolite P, the RBG etched in the dead wax. It's a thrill to have this record. This is the record to me.
Cool.
I mean, everything that I love about jazz, everything that is special about the art form is embodied on this record to me.
Cool. I agree completely.